The last thing my mother said to me before her stroke was that she wished Marcus could be there instead. She didn't whisper it, she didn't catch herself afterward. She just said it, the way you'd say, pass the salt, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. I was sitting right there, holding her hand, having driven 4 hours to be with her for her 72nd birthday. And she looked at me, smiled a little, and said, I just wish your brother could have made it. This would have meant more with him here. I remember nodding. I remember saying something like, I know, Mom. And then I drove home 4 hours in the dark and didn't cry until I was in my own driveway, engine still running, too tired to even make it inside. That was 8 months before the nursing home called. My name is Diane. I'm 51 years old. I live in a small house in western Pennsylvania with my dog Biscuit and more houseplants than any single person needs. And for most of my life, I believed something was fundamentally wrong with me. That I was the defective one. That there was a version of me that could have been lovable to my mother. If only I'd been born a little differently. It took me until I was in my 40s to start questioning that. And it took one phone call from a woman named Patricia at Meadowbrook Senior Living to finally understand what I'd been carrying and why it was time to put it down. But to understand any of that, you have to go back. You have to go back to the beginning. If you've ever sat at a family dinner table and felt like the only person in the room who could see what was actually happening, who could see the invisible scoreboard, the way certain names got said differently, the way certain children got excused for things that would have gotten you grounded for a month, then I need you to hit that subscribe button before I go any further. Because this story is going to need someone like you to hear it all the way through. Someone who already knows what it feels like to be the one who sees. I was born in 1972, the first child of Carol and Robert Hargrove, in a small town in Ohio that most people have never heard of and nobody ever leaves voluntarily. My dad worked at a machine parts plant. My mom stayed home. We weren't rich, but we weren't struggling either. The kind of family where there was always food on the table, always Christmas presents under the tree, always a general sense of normalcy on the surface that made it very hard to explain to other people what was wrong. Because from the outside, nothing was wrong. From the outside, we were a perfectly ordinary family. Marcus was born 3 years after me. And I want to be careful here, because Marcus wasn't a monster when we were kids. He was just a boy. He had dark hair and big brown eyes, and he cried easily as a baby. And my mother, who had been a somewhat distracted parent with me, completely transformed when he arrived. I don't mean that as an exaggeration. I have actual memories of the shift. The house felt different. She felt different, like someone had plugged her in. She carried him everywhere. She read to him every night. She signed him up for Little League and attended every single game, sitting in the front row with her little cooler and her foam seat cushion, cheering so loud the other parents would look over. She did not attend my school play in 3rd grade. She had a headache. I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for 8-year-old Diane. I'm telling you because these things accumulate. They layer, and when you're a child, you don't have the vocabulary to name what's happening. So you just absorb it into your bones and call it the way things are. The way things were, in our house, was that Marcus was the sun and I was somewhere in the outer rings. Not unwanted, exactly. Just not central, not lit up. My dad noticed. I think about that now. He would slip me an extra piece of pie when my mother wasn't looking. He'd sit on the edge of my bed sometimes and ask how school was going, really going, and actually listen to the answer. He was a quiet man, the kind of quiet that gets overlooked in families with loud personalities. But he was present with me in a way that kept me tethered. He was the thing that made it survivable. He died of a heart attack when I was 19 and Marcus was 16. And after that, there was nothing between me and the full weight of how my mother felt about her 2 children. Grief does strange things to people. It can make them tender and open, or it can make them smaller and harder, like a fist clenching around whatever they still have left. My mother chose the second option. She pulled Marcus close. I mean that almost literally. She rearranged her entire life around making sure he was okay. She sat with him for hours every night. She called his school to explain he was going through a difficult time and needed extra consideration. She took him on a trip to Florida that spring, just the 2 of them, to get his mind right. He was 16. It probably did help him. I was 19 and had just started community college, working 25 hours a week at a grocery store deli counter, and I don't remember anyone asking how my mind was. I went home most weekends that year. I did the laundry. I made sure there was food in the refrigerator. I sat across from my mother at the kitchen table and watched her stare at the seat where my dad used to be, and I tried to fill the silence in whatever way I could. She never quite looked at me when I was talking. It was like I was a radio playing in another room. At some point, I stopped going home as often. I graduated from community college, transferred to a state school, got a degree in accounting, moved to Pittsburgh for a job, and slowly built a life that was mine. I dated. I made friends. I had good years and hard years like everybody does. I was not unhappy, exactly. I just had this background hum of something unresolved that I'd gotten very good at ignoring. I called my mother every Sunday. She usually spent the first 10 minutes of the call telling me about Marcus, what he was up to, what funny thing he'd said, how well he was doing. I'd make interested sounds and ask follow-up questions. Occasionally, she'd ask about my life. I'd tell her things and she'd say, in a way that made it clear she was already thinking about something else. This went on for years. Decades, really. I want to tell you there was a big dramatic turning point somewhere in my 30s, some moment where I confronted it and it got resolved. There wasn't. It was just a long, slow accumulation of small confirmations. The Christmas she gave Marcus $3,000 for a down payment on a car and gave me a candle set. The time she came to Pittsburgh for what I thought was a visit to see me, and I discovered she'd actually come to see a Marcus who had been passing through. And I was just convenient geography. The time I had a minor surgery, nothing serious, but still, and she sent a Hallmark card that arrived 4 days after the procedure. I'm not saying any of those things individually would break a person. I'm saying when you've been collecting them since you were 8 years old, eventually you have enough that you could wallpaper a house. Marcus, for his part, grew into exactly the kind of adult you might expect from that upbringing. He was charming. He was the kind of person who walks into a room and immediately becomes the center of it without appearing to try. He was funny when he wanted to be, and warm when it served him. He also borrowed money from my mother at a rate that would have alarmed any financial advisor, paid back almost none of it, and somehow made her feel grateful every time he took it. I watched this happen in real time for years. $20 here, $100 there in his 20s. Then the amounts got bigger. His wife, a woman named Stacy, who I liked actually, who I genuinely liked, told me once over a glass of wine at Thanksgiving that she'd stopped trying to keep track of what Carol had given them because the number made her feel sick. She just can't say no to him, Stacy said. And honestly, I think part of her enjoys it. It's like she needs to be needed by him. I thought about that for a long time afterward. I think Stacy was right. My mother had constructed a whole identity around being essential to Marcus, and Marcus, whether consciously or not, had learned to give her that. He needed her in visible, dramatic ways, calling her during crises, leaning on her, performing a kind of emotional dependency that she found deeply fulfilling. I needed her in quieter ways. I needed her to show up. I needed her to ask the follow-up question. I needed her to remember, without being reminded, that my favorite color was green and not yellow, that I'd had a hard year, that I existed in her mind as a full person and not just a supporting character. She didn't know how to give me that. Or maybe she didn't want to. I'm still not sure which one is harder to make peace with. The year my mother turned 70, things started changing in ways that were hard to name at first. She'd always been sharp, quick with names, with details, with the exact wrong thing to say at the exact wrong moment. That required a kind of precision, actually. A precision I now recognize as exhausting for her to have carried all these years. But she started forgetting things. Small things at first. She called me Marcus twice in one phone call. She forgot she'd already told me a story and told it again 3 minutes later. I mentioned it to Marcus on one of the rare occasions we actually spoke. He dismissed it. She's always been a little scattered, he said. She's fine. She was not fine. By the time she turned 71, she'd had 2 minor falls, neither of which she'd told me about. I found out from a neighbor who'd been checking on her. She'd stopped driving but hadn't told anyone why. Her house, which she'd always kept immaculate, had started slipping. There were dishes in the sink, mail piled up on the counter. The carpet in the hallway had a stain that clearly needed cleaning, and the old version of my mother would never have let that go a single day. I started driving up more, once a month, then twice a month. I'd clean up, go through her mail, make sure her medications were organized, have dinner with her, try to get her to talk to her doctor about what was happening. She resisted on all of it. She was proud. She had always been proud. "I'm fine, Diane," she'd say. "You worry too much. You've always worried too much." I asked Marcus to come visit to see what I was seeing. He said he was slammed at work. He said he'd try to get up there when things settled down. He did not come. That year, the birthday trip, the one where she told me she wished Marcus were there instead of me. I had taken 2 days off work and booked a hotel nearby so I could spend the whole weekend with her. I brought her flowers, her favorite, yellow tulips. I took her to lunch at the Italian place she loved. I sat with her all afternoon and watched old home movies on her little DVD player, the ones from when we were kids. I watched her face when Marcus came on screen. It was something. It was the kind of look I'd spent my whole life wanting directed at me, and understanding by then that it never would be. When she said she wished he were there, I believe she meant it as a compliment. A strange, cutting, oblivious compliment. The kind of thing she might have thought was expressing how meaningful the day was. But it landed the way those things always landed with me. Like a confirmation of something I'd hoped wasn't true. I drove home in the dark. I sat in my driveway. I finally let myself think the thought I'd been circling for years, the thought I'd been too afraid to finish. I thought, I am never going to be enough for her. And I'm not sure that's about me anymore. That was the first time I'd thought it clearly. The first time I didn't immediately argue myself out of it. 8 months later, on a Wednesday morning in March, my phone rang at 6:47 a.m. I was already up, getting ready for work. I looked at the number, didn't recognize it, and almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me answer. "Is this Diane Hargrove?" The woman's name was Patricia. She was the director of care coordination at a place called Meadowbrook Senior Living in Ellersville, Ohio, a town about 40 minutes from where my mother lived. She told me, very calmly and very gently, that my mother had been brought in by ambulance the previous evening after a neighbor found her on the kitchen floor. She'd had a stroke. She was stable but needed immediate next-of-kin decision-making about her care plan. I said, "Why are you calling me?" "Marcus is her emergency contact." Patricia paused. "We did call that number, Ms. Hargrove. The number on file is no longer in service. We found your contact information through the county social services record when we were trying to locate next of kin." I remember sitting down on the edge of my bed. Marcus had changed his number. At some point, they looked into it later and determined it had been at least 6 months. My brother had changed his phone number and never updated it anywhere. Not with my mother. Not with her doctors. Not with any of the systems that existed for exactly this kind of emergency. Would you have walked out right then? Would you have called a lawyer or a social worker or told them to keep looking for Marcus and let him handle the situation he'd been designated to handle? Because standing in my bedroom at 6:47 in the morning, I genuinely didn't know what the right answer was. Part of me wanted to. Part of me, the part that had been accumulating those moments since I was 8 years old, thought, this is not my responsibility. She made her choice. She made it 1,000 times. Tell me in the comments. Tell me what you would have done. Because I've thought about this moment more times than I can count, and I still don't have a clean answer. I called my boss and said I had a family emergency. I threw clothes in a bag. I told Biscuit to be good, filled his bowl up, and drove 4 hours to Ellersville. My mother was in a hospital bed with an IV in her arm, and one side of her face slightly drooping, and she looked smaller than she ever had in my memory. She was awake. She knew who I was. The stroke had affected her mobility more than her cognition, at least at first, and when I walked in, she started crying. She reached for my hand with her left hand, the one that still worked, and she held it. She didn't say anything for a long time. I sat down in the chair next to her bed, and I looked at her face. This face I'd been looking at my whole life, and I thought, there you are. There's the person underneath all of it. I stayed for 3 days. I met with Patricia and the medical team and the social worker. My mother needed a higher level of care than she could get at home. She had options. There was a rehab facility first, then she'd need a decision about long-term care. It was a lot of paperwork, it was a lot of decisions. It required someone to be physically present, to make phone calls, to understand what Medicare covered and what it is, to tour facilities and ask questions and sign forms. I did all of it. I also tried to reach Marcus. I had an old email address for him from maybe 3 years ago. I had Stacy's number. They'd divorced the year prior, which I'd found out through a Christmas card, of all things. Stacy didn't have Marcus's new number, but gave me an address in Colorado, a city called Fort Collins, where she thought he might be living now. I sent an email to the old address. I wrote to the Fort Collins address. I called every number I had ever had for him and left messages on the ones that still had voicemail. I was not angry when I left those messages. I was deliberately, carefully, not angry. I just said there was a family emergency, that Mom needed us, and please call me back. It took him 11 days. 11 days, during which I continued driving up to Ellersville on the weekends, during which I helped my mother through the rehab facility intake, during which I sat with her in her physical therapy sessions and watched her slowly, painfully learn to walk steadily again, during which I sorted through her mail and found several overdue bills she'd been ignoring and got those organized, during which I had the extremely emotional experience of going through her house to identify what she might want with her and what could be stored and what she no longer needed. He called on a Tuesday evening. I was at my kitchen table with a spreadsheet open, going through her finances. "Hey," he said, like that, "hey." I told him what had happened. I went through it factually and completely, and did not let my voice do what it wanted to do, which was crack. He listened. He was quiet for a while, then he said, "Okay. I can try to come out there next month, maybe. What does she actually need?" I want you to sit with what he just said. Not "I'll be there tomorrow." Not "Oh God, what do you need from me right now?" Next month, maybe. And what does she actually need, as if I was calling about a favor he was being asked to consider. I told him she needed her son. I told him that the facility was very good, that the staff were kind, that she asked about him every single day. I told him I had been handling everything, but that I was not her emergency contact. I was not her power of attorney. That was still him, legally, and that there were decisions coming that he was going to need to be present for. He said he'd look at his schedule. That night I cried in a way I hadn't in a long time. Not sad crying. Angry crying, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and old. I cried for the birthday I drove 4 hours to attend. I cried for the Christmas candles. I cried for being 19 and doing the laundry in a house full of grief, and no one thinking to ask if I was okay. I cried for all of it at once, alone in my kitchen, with Biscuit putting his chin on my knee and looking up at me with those steady, reliable eyes that only dogs have. And then I dried my face. And I made a decision. I was going to keep showing up, not for Marcus, not to prove anything, not even, if I'm being honest, entirely for my mother. I was going to keep showing up because of who I wanted to be. Because I had spent my whole life being compared to a version of myself I couldn't control, and this was the one place where I had complete authority over the narrative. I could choose, and I wanted to be someone who chose to show up. I need you to understand that this was not a simple, peaceful realization. It was not graceful. It was the hardest thing I had done in a long time, but it was mine. The next 4 months were some of the most complicated of my life. My mother settled into Meadowbrook. It was a good facility, genuinely good, the kind of place where the staff remember your name within a week, and the activities director actually tries. She had a small room with a window that faced a courtyard with a little fountain, and she liked to sit near it in her wheelchair in the afternoons when the weather was decent. I visited every other weekend. I brought her things, her favorite lotion, a particular brand of crackers she liked, the crossword puzzle books she'd always done. I brought her photos for the dresser. I sat with her and watched her television shows and let her tell me stories I'd already heard, because repetition is part of the landscape now, and there's no use fighting the terrain. She started talking about my father a lot. She'd look at me sometimes with this expression I didn't quite recognize at first, and then I realized. She was seeing him in me. I look like him. I have his build, his coloring. I'd always known this, but somehow it had never been something she mentioned, and now she mentioned it often. "You have your father's hands," she said one Saturday afternoon. "I know," I said. "He had good hands." She nodded slowly. And then she said something I had not expected, something that fell into the room and changed the air in it. "He always worried about you," she said. "Not because you weren't doing fine. Because he thought I wasn't fair to you. I didn't say anything." He told me that. Twice. I didn't listen. She was looking at the fountain. I don't know why I didn't listen. I held very still. This is the thing about moments you've waited for, without knowing you were waiting for them. They don't arrive with fanfare. They arrive quietly, in a corner of a nursing home on a Saturday afternoon, and they're smaller and more human than you imagined. You didn't have to come here, she said. You know that. You could have made Marcus deal with it. I know, I said. Why didn't you? I thought about it. Because he wasn't going to. She was quiet for a long time. The fountain made its small sound. Somewhere down the hall, someone was playing a game show too loud. I'm sorry, Diane, she said. I know that's not enough. It wasn't enough. It was also something. And that's the complicated part, the part that no one tells you about when they talk about parents making amends. It's not a resolution. It's a beginning. And a beginning that comes when there's not a lot of time left. And you have to decide what to do with it anyway. I squeezed her hand. I told her it was okay. I don't know if that was the truest thing I've ever said or the most complicated, but it felt like the right thing to say in that moment, in that room, beside that fountain. Marcus showed up in June. He flew in, rented a car, and appeared at Meadowbrook on a Thursday morning. He looked good. Tan, a little heavier, a new haircut. Colorado seemed to agree with him. He walked into my mother's room, and she lit up with that look. The one I knew so well, the one that still did something to me even after everything. And they had a long, teary reunion that I watched from the doorway like I was watching something on television. He and I had coffee in the facility's little cafe area afterward. He was not unkind. He was not cruel. He was just the same. He thanked me for handling everything. He said it genuinely, I believe, the way you thank someone who covered a shift for you. He asked some questions about the logistics, about what things cost, about how long the doctors thought she'd be here. Then he said, I can probably cover some of the costs going forward if the finances are tight. I looked at him for a moment. She gave you around $40,000 over the years, Marcus. I went through her accounts. There's not a lot left. He didn't flinch the way I thought he might. He just nodded slowly, like a man confirming something he already vaguely knew. Yeah, he said. I know. You're not going to pay it back, I said. It wasn't a question. No, he said quietly. I'm not. I appreciated the honesty, actually. After everything, the honesty felt like a small gift. So here's what's going to happen, I said. I've already been managing her finances. I'm going to keep doing that. Her Social Security and her small pension cover most of Meadowbrook's fees. The gap is manageable if we're careful. I'll keep handling the logistics. What I need from you is to update your contact information with the facility, update your power of attorney forms, since yours need to be re-executed, and visit her regularly. Not next month, maybe. She asks about you every time I see her. He looked a little chastened. Not devastated, not tearful, just smaller than he usually seemed. You're not angry, he said. I was, I said. I'm tired of being angry. It takes too much. He visited her twice more that summer. Both times, she was happy. Both times, I wasn't there. I arranged it that way, deliberately, so the visits could be what they needed to be, without the weight of our whole history sitting in the room with us. I heard about the visits from Patricia, who told me my mother seemed very uplifted afterward. Good, I thought. Good. I want to tell you about a Tuesday evening in August, because I think it's the closest thing this story has to a turning point, even though it wasn't dramatic. Nothing exploded. No one confessed to anything. It was just a Tuesday. I was sitting with my mother after dinner. She'd had a good day. Physical therapy had gone well. She'd beaten 3 other residents at a card game she liked. She'd eaten most of her food. She was in a good mood, and we were talking easily, the way we rarely had in my whole adult life. She asked me about my job. She actually asked, and she listened to the answer, and she asked a follow-up question. She asked about Biscuit. She'd always liked dogs, something I'd forgotten. She asked if I was seeing anyone, and when I said no, she said, You should be. You deserve someone good. And I had to look away for a second, because it was such a simple thing to say, and it hit me so much harder than she'd probably intended. Then she asked, out of nowhere, whether I'd ever thought about what I would want people to say about me. At my funeral, I said. At anything, she said. Just. What you'd want people to say. I thought about it. That I showed up, I said. That when something needed doing, I did it. That the people in my life felt like they mattered to me. She was quiet. Is that it? She asked. Yeah, I said, I think that's enough. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said, Your father would have been so proud of you. I sat with that. I let it be what it was. Not a substitution for the version where she would have said it herself, a long time ago, but something real and true, said in a room with a fountain outside the window on an August evening. I know he would have been, I said. I think about him a lot. Me too, she said, every single day. It's November now. My mother is still at Meadowbrook. She had a second, smaller stroke in September that took a bit more of her language, so conversations are slower and shorter now. But she knows my face. She holds my hand. When I come in on Saturday mornings, she makes a sound that I can only describe as relief. Not surprise, not the lit-up joy she used to show for Marcus, but relief. The deep, bone-level relief of someone who knows they will not be abandoned. I don't know what to do with that. I am still figuring out what to do with that. Marcus calls her on Sundays. He's been consistent about it since June, and I choose to give him credit for that because consistency is its own form of showing up, even when it's late. We text occasionally, not warmly, but not coldly either. There's a version of us that might one day find a way to something easier. I hold that possibility loosely, without counting on it. My mother and I will never have the relationship I would have chosen. I'm 51 years old, and I know that now, the way you know something that used to hurt, and now just sits quietly in you like scar tissue. It's part of me, it shaped me, but it doesn't run me. What I didn't expect, what genuinely surprised me, is that the person I became in the absence of her approval turned out to be someone I actually like. Someone who drives 4 hours in the dark, because she decided that's who she is. Someone who builds spreadsheets for aging mothers who didn't prioritize her. Someone who tells her brother the truth without cruelty, and then goes home and makes herself a cup of tea and watches something dumb on television and sleeps. Fine. I don't want a gold star for that. I'm not telling you this story to be praised. I'm telling it because for most of my life, I thought the opposite of being the unfavored child was being the favored child. And what I actually found on the other side of this is something else entirely. I found out that being the one who shows up, not because you're rewarded for it, not because someone finally sees you, but because you decided that's who you are, that might be the closest thing to freedom I've ever felt. My dad showed me that. Quietly, in the margins, in pieces of pie handed to me when no one was looking, in questions asked and actually listened to. He showed me that you can love people who don't love you back the way you need, and that love isn't diminished by being unreturned. Yeah, he never said any of that out loud. He just lived it. I'm trying to do the same. There are still hard days. There are still Saturday mornings when I sit in my car in the Meadowbrook parking lot for a few extra minutes before going in, just gathering myself. There are still moments, a look she gives Marcus on the phone sometimes, a way her face changes when she hears his voice, that land somewhere old and sore in me. I don't think those will fully go away. I've stopped waiting for them to. What I have instead is something steadier. I have the knowledge of what I'm capable of, tested in a way that nothing else could have tested it. I have the certainty that when things fell apart, when everyone else disappeared, I was the one who answered the phone at 6:47 in the morning. Not because I was chosen, because I chose. That's mine. Nobody can take that away from me. The nursing home called me instead of my brother. And for the first time in my life, being the one who got called felt, in a strange and quiet way, like being seen. If this story reached something in you, if it reminded you of a table you sat at where you felt invisible, or a phone call you answered when you didn't have to, or a parent who didn't know how to give you what you needed, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment and tell me what you would have done in that parking lot at Meadowbrook. Tell me if you would have answered the phone. Tell me what you've had to make peace with that nobody around you fully understands. Subscribe so the next story finds you when you need it. These voices, the ones sitting in parking lots, doing the quiet, unglamorous work of loving difficult people, they deserve to be heard. And remember this, sometimes the one who gets called last is the one who was built for exactly that moment. Sometimes being overlooked your whole life is just preparation for the day you're needed most. Sometimes the person in the margins was always the one holding the whole picture together. You know who you are.